Mr. Augustus.
Wendell Ashby stood in a courtroom he had never expected to enter, staring at a lawyer he had met only once in his life, listening to her read his own name beside a number he could not fully comprehend. $31 million. A penthouse across the top 3 floors of one of Boston's most exclusive towers. All of it left to a man who had spent the last decade emptying trash bins and mopping marble floors after midnight, long after the residents upstairs had gone to sleep in beds he would never be able to afford. Somewhere in that stunned, silent room, past the shocked faces and the whispers already curdling into accusations, Wendell could hear only one voice in his memory, an old man's voice, trembling, asking him to promise he would never tell a single soul what happened between them. That promise had been made 3 years earlier, on a night nobody in the building thought would matter at all. To understand how a quiet, grieving janitor became the sole heir to one of the wealthiest men in Boston, we have to go back to the beginning, long before the will, long before the lawsuits, long before anyone outside a locked penthouse door had ever heard the name Augustus Kessler. Wendell Ashby was 54 years old, a widower who had learned to find some steadiness in routine ever since losing his wife 3 years before. 6 nights a week, he pushed his cart through the hushed hallways of the Sterling Tower, keeping the marble floors polished and the brass fixtures gleaming for residents who rarely looked at him twice. Augustus Kessler was something else entirely. He was 81, a retired textile magnate who had once controlled a business empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and yet not a single tenant in the building had laid eyes on him in more than 10 years. His groceries were left outside his door. His mail was collected by an assistant who came and went without a word to anyone. To the other residents of the Sterling Tower, Augustus Kessler was less a man and more a rumor whispered about in the elevator. Why would a man who trusted almost no one open his door to a janitor he barely knew? What really happened during those quiet, unrecorded visits that no family member ever witnessed and no security camera ever fully captured? And when his great-nephew finally learned the truth about where the family fortune was headed, what exactly was he willing to do to take it back? This story raises more questions than it answers at first, and every one of them matters. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand Wendell Ashby, you have to understand what he lost before any of this began. He and his wife, Colleen, had been married for 26 years, high school sweethearts, who built a small, unremarkable, deeply happy life together in a rented duplex on the edge of Dorchester. When Colleen passed away after a short illness, Wendell did not know how to fill the hours that used to belong to her. He took extra shifts. He kept his head down. He found a strange comfort in the late-night quiet of the Sterling Tower, in the sound of his own footsteps echoing off marble that never asked him a single question about his grief. His supervisor, a stocky, no-nonsense man named Dale Pruitt, respected him for exactly that reason. Wendell showed up. He did his job without complaint. He never gave anyone a reason to remember his name, and for a long time, that was exactly how he liked it. Augustus Kessler's story ran in the opposite direction entirely. He had built Kessler Textiles from a single struggling mill into a company that once employed thousands of people across New England, and by the time he sold the business in his 60s, he had more money than he ever knew what to do with. But wealth had not protected him from loss. His wife, Eleanor, died nearly 11 years before this story begins, and something in Augustus seemed to close along with her. He stopped attending events. He stopped taking calls. He retreated into the top 3 floors of the Sterling Tower and rarely left them again. His only remaining family, A great-nephew named Roland Kessler Vance visited a handful of times a year, and almost never without a folder of paperwork tucked under his arm. The first real meeting between these two men happened almost by accident. A pipe had burst 2 floors below the penthouse late on a Tuesday night, and Dale Pruitt sent Wendell upstairs to check whether the leak had reached higher floors. Wendell knocked, expecting no answer at all, since almost no one ever got one. Instead, the door opened just a crack, and an old man's tired, wary eyes studied him from the darkness of the entryway. Augustus let him in only long enough to check the pipes, but as Wendell worked, he noticed the untouched dust on the furniture, the silence, the sheer emptiness of a home built for a family that never came. Before he left that night, Augustus said something Wendell would replay in his mind for weeks afterward, quiet and almost pleading. He asked him not to tell anyone what he had seen inside that apartment. Wendell went home, that night, to his own empty duplex, and found himself unable to stop thinking about the penthouse he had just left. He understood, in a way few other people in that building ever could, exactly what it felt like to move through enormous, quiet rooms that used to hold someone else's voice. Boston outside kept moving the way it always did, delivery trucks idling on cobblestone side streets, the harbor wind cutting between buildings, life carrying on at its usual pace for everyone except the 2 men who had just quietly recognized something familiar in each other. Wendell did not go back upstairs the following night. He told himself it was not his place, that Augustus Kessler was simply another resident on his rounds, someone whose privacy deserved to be respected exactly as requested. Wendell kept that promise, but he could not stop thinking about the old man alone behind that door. A week later, on a slow overnight shift, he found himself standing outside the penthouse again, this time with 2 cups of coffee instead of a toolbox. He knocked, unsure whether Augustus would even remember him. The door opened anyway. What began as a 5-minute check-in slowly became a standing, unspoken routine. Twice, sometimes 3 times a week, Wendell would finish his rounds early and spend a quiet half-hour with Augustus, listening to him talk about the mill he built from nothing, about Eleanor, about a life that had once been full and now felt unbearably empty. Wendell rarely said much in return. He mostly listened, the same way he had once listened to Colleen at the end of long days, and Augustus seemed to need exactly that kind of company more than anything money could buy. There was a particular evening, several weeks into this quiet routine, when Augustus asked Wendell to open the curtains he normally kept drawn across the entire western wall of the penthouse. Neither man said much, as the last light of a Boston sunset spread across furniture that had not seen daylight in years. Augustus admitted, almost embarrassed by the confession, that Eleanor used to insist on opening those same curtains every single evening, and that he had not been able to bring himself to do it alone since she passed. It was a small moment, unremarkable to anyone who might have witnessed it from outside, but it marked something neither man fully acknowledged at the time. The slow, careful rebuilding of a life Augustus had assumed was simply over. Meanwhile, Roland Kessler Vance's visits continued on their usual schedule, and they never once resembled what was happening upstairs after dark. Roland arrived in tailored suits, carrying updated estate documents and talk of consolidating assets, always circling back to questions about Augustus's health and his long-term plans for the business holdings that remained. He rarely stayed more than 20 minutes. He rarely asked Augustus how he was actually feeling. To Roland, his great-uncle's isolation was simply an inconvenience to be managed from a distance, a problem to be solved with lawyers rather than with time. As the months passed, Augustus's health began to decline in small, quiet ways that only someone paying close attention would notice. A tremor in his hands, a shortness of breath, climbing from one room to another. Wendell urged him more than once to see a doctor, but Augustus refused every physician that Roland's office attempted to send, insisting he trusted no one wearing a suit who had been hired by his own family. He trusted Wendell instead, a man who wanted nothing from him and had never once asked for anything. It was during this stretch of quiet, declining months that Augustus began making private phone calls Wendell was never part of, calls that ended the moment anyone else entered the room. One night, near the end of this period, Wendell arrived to find Augustus seated at his desk, a stack of papers turned face down in front of him. Augustus said nothing about what he had been working on, only that he had finally made a decision about something that had been weighing on him for a long time. He asked Wendell to sit with him a while longer than usual that night, and when Wendell finally left, Augustus thanked him in a tone that felt heavier than gratitude usually did, as though he were saying goodbye to something, though neither of them said so out loud. Looking back, Wendell would later admit he sensed something had shifted that night, though he could not have named what it was at the time. Augustus had never before thanked him so directly, and he had never before asked him to stay quite so long. There was a stillness in the old man's voice that Wendell recognized from his own life, the particular calm that sometimes settles over a person once they have finally made peace with a decision they had been avoiding for months. Wendell walked home that night, turning the conversation over in his mind, certain only that something in Augustus Kessler's life had quietly, permanently changed, and that he had somehow been trusted to witness it. 3 weeks later, Wendell knocked on the penthouse door and received no answer at all. He let himself in, using the master key Dale Pruitt kept for emergencies, calling out into the quiet apartment, and found Augustus in his armchair by the window, looking as though he had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. The coroner would later confirm what the stillness of the room already suggested, that Augustus Kessler had passed peacefully, without pain, sometime in the early hours of the morning. Wendell stood in that apartment for a long moment before he could bring himself to call anyone, overwhelmed by a grief he had not expected to feel this deeply for a man he had known for only a few years. Word reached Roland Kessler Vance within hours, and the family descended on the Sterling Tower with a speed that unsettled even the building staff who were used to sudden, urgent visits from wealthy relatives. Before the funeral arrangements were even finalized, Roland was already meeting privately with estate representatives, discussing the transfer of holdings, the penthouse, the investment accounts, speaking about his great-uncle's death in the clipped, efficient language of a business transaction rather than a loss. Dale Pruitt watched the family move through the lobby with a wary, uneasy feeling he could not quite explain, though he kept it to himself. Within days, Marguerite Colby, the attorney who had managed the Kessler estate for nearly 2 decades, called for a formal reading of the will. She was known throughout Boston's legal circles for her precision and her refusal to be rushed by grieving, impatient families, and this case was no exception. She scheduled the reading for the following week and requested that every immediate party be present, including, to everyone's confusion, a member of the building's maintenance staff whose name meant nothing to anyone in the Kessler family at the time. When Roland questioned why a janitor needed to attend a private estate matter, Marguerite offered only a calm, measured response that did nothing to ease the growing unease in the room. She informed the family, without elaborating further, that there were, in fact, 2 wills currently on file for Augustus Kessler, and that the reading would address exactly which one was legally valid. In the days leading up to the reading, Wendell received a call from Marguerite's office asking him to appear, and he assumed, reasonably enough, that it was simply a routine matter, perhaps a question about the last morning he had seen Augustus alive. He had no idea he was about to become the center of a dispute that would consume a wealthy Boston family for months to come. He arrived at the downtown offices in his work jacket because it was the only formal clothing he really owned, and he sat quietly near the back of the room, still grieving a friend most of the people around that table had barely bothered to visit while he was alive. The reading took place in a quiet conference room downtown, the Kessler family seated on one side of a long table, Wendell Ashby seated uncomfortably near the far end, still wearing his work jacket because no one had told him to dress otherwise. Marguerite Colby began by confirming the earlier will, drafted years before, that distributed the estate largely among Augustus's remaining relatives, with Roland positioned as the primary beneficiary. For a moment, the room seemed to relax, as though the strange summons had simply been a formality. Then Marguerite set that document aside and produced the second one, signed and formally notarized only weeks before Augustus Kessler's death. In it, Augustus left the penthouse, the majority of his remaining estate, and ownership of the top 3 floors of the Sterling Tower, to Wendell Ashby by name, describing him in his own written words as the only person who had shown him genuine humanity in the final years of his life, asking for nothing in return. The room fell into a silence that did not last long. Roland stood so abruptly that his chair scraped hard against the floor, insisting the document could not possibly be legitimate, that his great-uncle would never have written a janitor into his estate over his own blood family. He accused the will of being the product of manipulation, of an old, isolated man taken advantage of in his final weakened months, his voice rising with every word until Marguerite finally asked him to sit back down. Wendell said almost nothing throughout the entire exchange, too stunned to fully process what he was hearing, still holding on to the memory of an old man who had simply wanted someone to sit with him a while longer. Before the meeting ended, Roland turned toward the table one final time, and in a voice tight with barely controlled anger, announced that he already had evidence that would prove this so-called will should never have been allowed to stand. The other relatives at the table exchanged uneasy glances, some clearly uncertain whether to side with Roland's outrage or to quietly wonder, for the first time, how little any of them had actually shown up for Augustus in his final years. Marguerite Colby closed her folder calmly, unmoved by the outburst, and reminded everyone present that any formal challenge would need to go through the proper legal channels, rather than a raised voice in a conference room. Wendell left that meeting in a daze, walking several blocks through the cold Boston evening before he even thought to call a cab, still trying to understand how an old man's quiet request for company had turned into a fortune he had never asked for and now was not entirely sure he was allowed to keep. Within a week, Roland Kessler Vance filed a formal legal challenge contesting the validity of the will, and the story quietly began making its way into local news coverage, framed as the strange, almost unbelievable case of a building janitor suddenly inheriting a multi-million-dollar fortune. Reporters called the Sterling Tower, asking for comment. Neighbors who had never once spoken to Wendell in the hallway now watched him differently, some with sympathy, others with open suspicion. Roland's legal team argued publicly that Augustus had been isolated, unwell, and vulnerable to influence in his final months, and that Wendell had used his access to the penthouse to manipulate a lonely old man out of his rightful family inheritance. Marguerite Colby, unwilling to let those accusations stand unchallenged, began combing through Augustus's private records as part of the estate's defense. What she found quietly dismantled the narrative Roland was building in public. Years of handwritten letters, personal journal entries, and private notes revealed a detailed, consistent account of the friendship between Augustus and Wendell, describing conversations about grief, about Eleanor, about a business built from nothing, written in Augustus's own hand long before any will had ever been changed. It was, in Marguerite's words during a private meeting with Wendell, the most thoroughly documented case of genuine care she had encountered in nearly 20 years of estate law. Still, the legal process ground forward slowly, and Wendell found himself questioned for hours by attorneys determined to find some inconsistency, some hidden motive, some proof that his relationship with Augustus had been anything other than what it appeared to be. Dale Pruitt, called in to testify about Wendell's work history, spoke plainly about a man who had never once asked for special treatment, who had simply shown up, night after night, long before anyone imagined a fortune might ever be involved. The turning point came from an unexpected place entirely. While cataloging personal items from the penthouse for the estate inventory, an assistant working with Marguerite's office discovered a small digital recorder tucked into a drawer of Augustus's desk, its final recording dated only days before his death. No one in the family had known it existed. Marguerite listened to the recording alone in her office before deciding what, if anything, to do with it. By the time it finished, she understood she was no longer looking at a simple inheritance dispute between a wealthy family and an outsider who happened to be in the right place at the right time. She placed a call to the presiding judge's clerk that same afternoon, requesting an emergency hearing, and told her assistant to prepare copies for both legal teams. Whatever else this recording contained, it was clear it would change the direction of the entire case, and possibly the reputation of a family that had spent weeks publicly painting Wendell Ashby as an opportunist. When Marguerite played the recording for the court, it was Augustus Kessler's own voice, steady despite his failing health, explaining in careful detail exactly why he had chosen to leave everything to Wendell Ashby. He spoke of a man who visited him with nothing to gain, who sat with him through long, difficult nights without ever once mentioning money, who reminded him, in the quietest possible way, what it felt like to matter to someone again. But the recording held one more revelation nobody in that courtroom expected. Augustus described, in his own words, a conversation in which household staff had once been quietly pressured by Roland to delay calling for medical help during a health scare months earlier, a decision Augustus said had left him certain, for the first time, about who truly had his best interests at heart. The recording changed everything. What had looked to the outside world like a straightforward family inheritance dispute now revealed a far more troubling motive behind Roland's urgency. A great-nephew who stood to gain enormously from his uncle's decline and had, according to Augustus's own account, been willing to let that decline happen faster than it should have. The court ultimately upheld the second will as fully valid, ruling that Augustus Kessler had been of sound mind and clear intention when he made his final wishes known, and Wendell Ashby's inheritance was formally confirmed. Roland Kessler Vance ultimately withdrew his legal challenge, rather than face the recording being entered fully into the public record, and what remained of his relationship with the rest of the family quietly fell apart in the months that followed. Some relatives stopped speaking to him altogether. Others simply drifted, unwilling to be associated any longer with the story that had, by then, made its way through every corner of Boston's social circles. Wendell, for his part, never once appeared eager to gloat over the outcome. He gave a short, careful statement to a single local reporter. Thanking Augustus for a friendship he said he would trade every dollar of the inheritance to have back in its original, uncomplicated form, and then he asked, politely but firmly, to be left alone. In the end, this was never really a story about money at all. It was about a lonely old man who was finally seen, not by the family who stood to profit from his fortune, but by a stranger who simply showed up night after night, expecting nothing in return. It raises a question worth sitting with, long after the credits roll, about what we actually owe the people closest to us, and whether real inheritance has less to do with what is written in a will and more to do with who chooses to stay. News of the final ruling spread quickly through Boston, and for a short while, Wendell Ashby became something of an unwilling local celebrity, recognized in grocery stores and stopped on the street by people who had followed every twist of the story online. He handled the attention the same way he had handled almost everything else in his life, quietly, without much fanfare, more interested in returning to something resembling normalcy than in any spotlight the inheritance had placed him under. Dale Pruitt joked, more than once, that Wendell was probably the only multimillionaire in the state of Massachusetts who still asked to keep his old shift schedule for as long as the building would allow it. Today, Wendell Ashby still lives a quiet life, though almost everything else has changed. He has kept his old apartment in Dorchester for now, unwilling to rush into a penthouse that still feels, in many ways, like it belongs to someone else's memory. He has quietly begun using part of his inheritance to fund a small assistance program for elderly residents living alone in his old neighborhood, the kind of support he wishes someone had offered Augustus years earlier. Dale Pruitt still runs the maintenance crew at the Sterling Tower, and he says Wendell still stops by sometimes, just to see how everyone is doing. So we want to hear from you. Do you think Wendell truly earned what he was given, or should family always come first, no matter how absent they've been? Let us know what you would have done in his position, and if this story moved you, stay close, because our next video uncovers a secret even more difficult to believe. Thanks for watching.